So parents, I'm going to open this evening by trying to provide a defense about why Christians should be people who love books. Now, anybody who knows me personally would know that if I didn't have an excellent wife, I would probably fall into something along the lines of Erasmus of Rotterdam said about himself. That when I have a little money, I buy books. And if I have any left, I buy food and clothes. Again, if you know me, you know that would probably be me, again, if I didn't have a wife and a family who kind of forced me not to do that. And if you've heard me talk much about the school, you've heard me talk a lot about books. Books are really important for me, but they're also a really important part of what we're doing here, and I don't think that that's a coincidence with the fact that we are a classical Christian school. So tonight, again, a brief apologetic for books. I know that there are many of you in here who don't need to be convinced of that. So if you're already on board with this, if I'm preaching to the choir, hopefully this is convincing and entertaining. All right. So I have two simple points for defending the argument that Christians should be people who love books. And that is, on one hand, books have value in what they do. Books have a sort of actually, not in what they do, but what they are. There is an intrinsic value in books. Books bless us. So that's going to be the first part of my argument. And the second part of my argument is that while they have an intrinsic value, there's also an extrinsic value to them as well. That is, they have a value in what they do. So they have a value in what they are, they have a value in what they do. They have intrinsic value, they have extrinsic value, or to put it differently, books both bless us and shape us. So to begin with, books bless us. And I think if we think of books as being a blessing to us, we have to realize first and foremost that books are a gift from God. If we believe that God is the God who created all things, and that he is the father of all gifts, and that all good things come from him, if books are a good thing, then they are from God. And as we think about, how are they a gift? How are they a blessing? Well, in books, we see the gift of language. In books, we see the gift of ideas. In books, we see the gift of stories. And all these are good things that are part of God's good creation. Yes, people abuse them. Yes, people's sinful hearts twist them for ill purposes. But it doesn't change that fundamentally that they are good things to be received as gifts from our Heavenly Father. It is quite an astonishing phenomenon when we think about what a book is. Okay, so this idea of a book, we actually have to begin with a person, right? Books don't just appear out of nowhere. It begins with a person. They begin in a mind. And this mind may exist right now and be somewhere alive in the world. This mind may have existed a decade ago, a century ago, a millennia ago. And because God created us in his image and gave us the ability to think and have ideas, but not just to have ideas, he then also gave us this gift of language, which we can then write those thoughts, those ideas down on pages, and on those pages into books. And then those ideas from a person that have been put into words onto pages can then be read by another person who with their mind then can comprehend, at least to some degree, the thoughts that another person had. It's quite astounding. And if we think about the fact that that's not just a person who's living today, but we can actually comprehend the thoughts of a person who lived 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago. Isn't that quite stunning? I mean, it's common sense. I don't think anybody would deny that line of reasoning, but how often do we pause just to think about how incredible this thing is that we can communicate ideas across centuries, across millennia, through books. Through books, we can receive the wisdom of Socrates. Though he wasn't part of God's chosen people, there is great wisdom there that we can glean from it. We can gain knowledge and insight and love and passion from St. Augustine. We can delight in the stories of Eusebius and the early church. And we can have fun and gratification in the tales from Chaucer. So we see that books are this astonishing phenomena as a gift from God. But books also display beauty. Now this is an interesting point. I don't know how often people's minds, when they think about books, they think about beauty. But I think this is a crucial point that we not overlook. When we think of music, we can appreciate it as something to be enjoyed for its own self, right? I'm sure as I even say that, you probably have a favorite song or album or something that comes to mind. I know for me, I love Josh Garrels a lot, and his music comes to mind. But there are also great works of the past. There's the works of a classical piece that comes to mind is Handel's Messiah. What a glorious piece of music that I don't really have to justify it to enjoy it. I don't have to think of some alternative thing that I get from it particularly. It's just something to be delighted in itself, to be enjoyed because it's beautiful, right? We get this with music, that music is beautiful, so it's to be enjoyed for itself. Some of us get this with art. I will say, personally, I've not really gotten that much into visual art, but that says more about me than it does about the world of art, right? It's just something I've never really taken the time to appreciate. But even me, someone who's not really a connoisseur of art or someone who's really taken the time to appreciate it, there are certain paintings that have just had a profound impact on me. William Blake's Nebuchadnezzar. The first time I saw that picture, it just blew my mind. I don't know, it may have just been where I was at emotionally and knowing the picture of Nebuchadnezzar being humbled by God. But for those of you who haven't seen it, is this painting of King Nebuchadnezzar who had been humbled by God and made to wander like a beast in the field. And it just had this profound impact on me. Same with Gustave Doré's Leviathan. Okay, here I'm dropping these names as though I know all sorts of art history and whatnot. These are like the only two paintings I know by name. Okay, besides maybe like the Mona Lisa or something. But I think we at least get the idea that art is something that can be appreciated for its own sake. I don't have to, say, what do I get from art? We understand that it's something to be enjoyed in itself. And so it is with books. But not that they have an intrinsic value in some ultimate sense, right? Because there's only one being in the universe who has true intrinsic value, and that is our God and our Creator. But God does instill value in things, and there's a value and a beauty in it as instilled by God that we can appreciate. So in books, we have beautiful language. You can think of Shakespeare or Dante's Divine Comedy. We can have moving stories. Maybe this is a more relatable point. Moving stories of King Arthur and his men at the Round Table. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. There are sweeping epics. Homer's Odyssey. A really fun one that I'm guessing most people haven't read is G.K. Chesterton's The Ballad of the White Horse King. Okay? And if you aren't familiar with the titles that I list, I'm sure there's other ones that could come to mind for you that have had a similar impact. But again, books have a beauty in them, an intrinsic, again, not in an ultimate sense, but in a secondary sense, a value within themselves that doesn't necessarily need to be justified based on what they do for us. And I begin with this point, not because I don't think books do good things for us. That's going to be the second piece of my defense of why Christians should love books, that they do things for us. They do shape us. But I think it's important to first recognize that books are worth valuing in and of themselves, again, as good gifts from our God to us. But books don't just bless us. Books shape us. Okay, and I have two ways that I'm going to, as quickly as possible, try to talk about them shaping us. One way they shape us is personally. That is, without getting myself in trouble, being a good Presbyterian, they can have a sanctifying effect. Now, in my church tradition, we talk about means of grace. That is, God has given his church certain things to shape his people. And we talk often about that being the Word, God's Word, both preached and read, the sacraments, Lord's Supper and baptism, and prayer. Those are the gifts that God has given his people to sanctify them and shape them into being more like Christ. So those are what I would call capital letter means of grace. But there are all sorts of lowercase means of grace, things that God uses in this world to shape us as well. A fireside chat with close friends, a good movie, or a wonderful book. Okay? And I think books are pretty high up on the list of those lowercase sense means of grace, as being something that God uses to shape his people. Never to take supremacy over the word, the sacrament, and prayer, those ultimate gifts that God has given to his church, but as an important part of how he has shaped his people over the centuries. So books can shape us spiritually, but they can also shape us very practically. Now, again, I'm supposed to be wrapping up and moving this along tonight, so I just want to talk about one last piece, one way that they shape us practically, and that is they help shape our ability to communicate. Now, I'm drawing heavily from, I'm not supposed to say this, my favorite pedagogue, Andrew Pudewa. Okay, the teachers all gave me a very funny look when I was like, oh, Andrew Pudewa is my favorite pedagogue, and there was like this, but it's just a, Washington Irving begins The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by saying, there's a new pedagogue in town. He's just talking about the teacher. Okay, so Andrew Pudewa is my favorite teacher. All right? And for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he's the guy who's behind Institute for Excellence in Writing, IEW, which you'll be hearing about from Mrs. Odell, which is why I need to speed things up. And he has this excellent lecture, which I can make available to you all, put it in this week's CKA News. And it's a lecture called Nurturing Competent Communicators. And he says that it's the best stuff. Like if anybody says, what's the one thing I need to hear from you, Mr. Pudewa? You've had a large impact, a large influence. What do you personally think are the most important things from your career as an educator? He said, this is it. And he's put it all in there, and it's all about cultivating communication skills in our children. And at the heart of that, he says books. But he says we have to be careful, because books just themselves don't necessarily do that. And he talks about how you think of the stereotypical kid who just reads book after 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 book. That doesn't always translate to being a strong communicator. And he points out that a lot of those kids who read books like that are speeding through their books. And they're not picking up actually on the beauty of the language. They're just getting the story. Okay, so they're doing book after book after book, but they're actually not benefiting from the language. And so Andrew Pudewa, and he says not everybody's reading like that. There are people who actually slow read and can read by themselves. But he says ultimately he thinks the best solution to that is to read out loud a lot. And he says when you read out loud, you actually get to hear the language patterns. And the benefit you get from the books isn't just a large vocabulary, which is what I think most people would think. What's the benefit of reading a lot of books? You get a lot of words, and you can use those big fancy words like pedagogue, right? But more importantly, he says the benefit of reading these books is the language pattern that you get, that just this a more sophisticated syntax. He talks about when he was in Japan learning Japanese, he hit this brick wall, and he wasn't sure what to do, so he memorized Jack and the Beanstalk in Japanese. And he said it had two benefits. One of them was that he could go to parties and entertain children by reciting Jack and the Beanstalk in Japanese. But he said he also found himself picking up on certain sentence structures that from what he'd memorized, and then adapting them for just everyday conversation. So it's not just the words you get in these books, but it's the sentence structure. But that only then he goes on to say, but that only comes if you're reading good books, right? There's a lot, in his words, there's a lot of dross out there. He says that a lot of adult fiction, which, truth is, reading isn't very in vogue in our time, at least in our culture at large. And among a lot of stuff that is read by adults is self-help books. I read plenty of self-help books, nothing wrong with them, but this is the main diet of reading for many people, self-help books and pop fiction. And he says what a lot of the adult fiction that we have out there is really no different than youth fiction, just written for more adult audience. Or specifically, he says this: if you look at it objectively, the only difference between Danielle Steel, I don't even know who that is, I'm assuming he's a pop fiction writer like that you'd find on the grocery aisle. Anybody in here? She? Okay, Danielle Steel. I do apologize for this ahead of time if you're a big Danielle Steel fan. If you look at it objectively, the only difference between a Danielle Steel and the Babysitter's Club is the length of the book and the debauchery of the characters. The actual language, vocabulary, and sophistication of the content isn't that much different, okay? I'm not saying go stop reading Danielle Steel, but I think we have to realize, I think that this is representative of the kinds of books that are out there in our time. And that a lot of the books that we have really are written at a very low language. There's not very much sophistication. There's not much there to them. It doesn't make them bad, but if that's the only kind of book you're reading, you're not going to get the kind of benefit that he says you can get from reading books that are more rich in language. So what's the point? His kind of conclusion is that reading good books well, especially out loud, will help shape us into stronger communicators. For your children, reading good books out loud will help shape them into strong communicators as well. Again, there's a lot more things I could say about books, but I'm way past time already. So let me try to land this plane and say takeaway. In describing what we do here at the school, there have been quite a number of times where I've said to people, we're really about reading. And every time I say that, it's like, it just feels like it falls so flat. It's like, what school isn't about reading, right? What schools be like, yeah, we don't really read over here, okay? But when I say that, I mean I think a lot more than what you would find in other schools. And so I think to better communicate what I would love to see happen here at Christ the King is I'd love to see a culture of reading, a culture of books, a people who are marked by their love of books. That we would be a people, that we would be a school where we read often. That means a lot of time in class and a lot of time at home is spent reading, that we try to clear up other things to devote time to just reading, because there's benefit in that in and of itself. But that we also are teaching our students to read well, that is, attentively and appreciatively. One of the ways we're doing that is through commonplace books, trying to get them to look for excellent sections to copy down and have a lifelong book where they keep the best of their quotes that they find as they're reading books. That we read real books. You might be wondering, well, what's a fake book? What I'm talking about is trying to avoid textbooks as much as possible. We do have textbooks here, but as often as possible, we try to find what Charlotte Mason would call living books. Books where there's a clear sense of the author, and there's a clear sense of the history to the book as well. Here at the Academy, we tried our best to choose good books, the best of the best. Sometimes people call that classics, but what we're really just talking about is the books that have endured through the ages and stood the test of time as being the best of their time. And here at the Academy, we try to do as much reading out loud as possible. And hopefully that carries over into the home, which is part of the reason that we're doing the family read-alouds each week as well. My hope is that our students become lifelong readers who love to read good books, and that families, all of families, even those families that do read a lot, we can continue to grow in their appreciation and practice of reading. And why? Because books are a good gift from God that bless us and shape us.